Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I don't know where it's like where you are right now, but it is very cold and we're in the midst of an ice storm and we have another 20 centimeters of snow on our way. We've had a really snowy winter. So we're going to take an exploration through failure in science, and we're going to take a look at some data we have with respect to student failure and student perspectives of failure. Make sure you have the chat box open. This is quite an interactive session where I'd really like some of your opinions. I'm going to ask you to give me some word associations in a little bit. So we know that failure is critically important for learning. It's really important that we are comfortable with being uncomfortable. Our brains remember things better when we are uncomfortable. And there's so many different ways that failure comes up in the learning process, but we don't teach students how to embrace failure. We don't teach students how to deliberately learn from failure across disciplines, usually within our higher ed curriculum. And there are some things that we know that intersect with failure that it's really important that we speak openly about. Risk and fear are two key ones. And it used to be thought that motivation and curiosity with toddlers, that toddlers were more curious than adults. Do you remember the sort of saying that, toddlers are always getting into everything, they're more curious than adults, but they've actually shown that adults are equally as curious. It's just that we're much more risk adverse. And so when we're talking about curiosity or motivation to learn or risk or fear of failure, we really have to talk about some of these things at the same time. We also need to talk about procrastination and perfectionism. And these are two things that really go hand in hand, and they contribute to one's fear of failure. A lot of the advice around procrastination is time management advice. It treats procrastination like a time management disorder or fault, and it isn't really. It's actually more of mood management than time management. And so as we work with students around failure, we have to talk openly about procrastination and perfectionism. So I'm going to come back to some of these 6 themes you see on the screen. So when we look at narratives of failure in society, there are certain narratives that get celebrated. Can you just come over to the chat, and we're all going to hit enter at the same time. So I'm going to ask you to write in the chat, and we'll all hit enter at the same time. So in the chat, can you think of a failure? It could be a person, it could be a thing that is celebrated in society. So just think of any example. Give ourselves about 5 seconds. Type an example into the chat and hit enter. So let's share our examples. The Antarctic expeditions, 300 Spartans, penicillin discovery. Yeah, absolutely, because penicillin, with Fleming, it was a failure to isolate it and reproduce it. And it wasn't until Florian Chain and others came along in the Second World War, they were able to mass produce penicillin. And when we look at narratives of failure in the public realm, there are some that are quite common. Sometimes there are accidents, and we confuse an accident with a failure. But if we are more open to risk and we're more open to failure, we're more likely to have happy accidents in terms of innovation or discovery in science. So you might know what this is. This is the little blue pill Viagra, and this was actually a failure / fortunate accident. It was never developed for its current function. It was developed with respect to cardiac and heart issues. And during clinical trials, they found that actually it was working the way it was designed with respect to heart vessel function, but it wasn't working on the heart. It was working elsewhere in the body. And so that was actually an accident with respect to that narrative of innovation. Does anyone know what this is? I invite you to type in the chat. Do you know what this structure is on your screen? Yeah, this is a pacemaker, and this was also an accident. It was a wrong piece was used in the pacemaker, and then it was found that it was this creating a rhythmic beat that mimicked a heartbeat. And so it was accidental. A wrong piece was used when it was being constructed for another purpose. So when we look at narratives of failure, there's lots of quotes that people talk about. There's lots of career journeys that people talk about. So Oprah Winfrey was fired from her first job in broadcasting. Thomas Edison, there's a quote that's misquoted all the time, but it goes something like, I didn't fail, I just found 10,000 ways that didn't work. It's thought that he didn't say that exact thing, but it's often misquoted. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, and then he was rehired back when he had started this other company. And Michael Jordan has talked about the number of shots that he's missed and the number of times he was trusted to take the last shot of the game and he missed it and they lost the game. Something all these people have in common, though, is that their failures eventually led to successes. And that's why we talk about them. They have happy endings. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So when we ask the general public, practice makes, finish the sentence. Almost everyone will say perfect. Practice makes perfect. And what we really want to transition to, especially in the context of science education, is that practice makes progress. We want to try things and fail and learn from failure. And failure is critically important in the process of science. But when we look at textbooks are narratives of success in science, usually by folks from the dominant group, usually by white men. Who is allowed to fail? Who has second chances? Who has structural supports that allow them to fail? And how do we learn from failure? How do you do this within an institutional structure where you need to get publications, you need to get that next grant? And so this is something we're looking at in the context of science education. How can we reframe failure so it is a process and not a defining event? And so this was an interesting study, came out of Nature Communications. This is actually an Economist article. They redid some of the figures, and I like how they did that. So these were applications for the National Institutes of Health grant. And if you look at the center line here, there are near win applicants that just made the cutoff and near miss applicants that just missed the cutoff and they did not get funding. What these researchers did is they followed these applicants out over time. And they actually found that the near miss applicants that had that initial failure, if you follow them out within 5 years and 10 years of publications, they actually had a higher percent of hit papers and they had a higher average number of citations. And there's ongoing work to look at this phenomenon. There's lots of different ways we could look at failure in science and whether or not we get grants is one. So science is a team sport, and there's lots of students and partners that have contributed to some of the work I'm going to show you today. This is a selection of some of our student research fellows that have been working on FLIP, failure, learning, in progress. What does this look like in science? What does it look like across disciplines? So we're actually working with, these are 2 postdoctoral fellows. They've actually now both started faculty positions. We are searching for a science education postdoctoral fellow. I'm happy to share the job ad with you if anyone is interested. They were looking at this FLIP project in the context of science. Dr. Nunes was in science. Dr. Guadagnolo was looking at tech and information technology. And then we have other collaborators that are working in other disciplines. Dr. LaLiberte is from geography, Dr. Cowan from history, Dr. Derry from historical studies, and Jackie Goodman is working with Center for Student Engagement. So this is sort of a lot of different spokes on the wheel of this project, and we're not going to go through everything. We're just going to explore a few highlights. So at the core, the funding that we've received for this is looking at failure's role in learning in higher education. And we could look at it as part of the core learning process. You don't need to read the little details on the figure. I've just put them here so you have them later on the slides if you're interested in some of the things that we're doing. But how do we teach students to learn from failure? What types of resources do we need? What types of supports do we need as instructors? How do you do this as an instructor when your position might be dependent upon student evaluations of teaching? There is an interesting friction there that's worth exploring. We're looking at discipline-specific roles of failure. What does it look like in different disciplines? In science, it's core to the scientific process. Why didn't something work? Figure that out. Why did you get surprising data? In engineering, what was the reason for that bridge or that structure collapse? In business, fail fast, fail often with your startup companies. That's a common refrain in business. In pharmacy, health prescription errors, there's a lot of literature on that. But what does it look like in the context of the humanities, or in writing, in English, revision assignments where you're allowed to rewrite something based on feedback? That would be an example of learning through struggle or learning through failure. Another thing we're looking at is this transition to higher ed from high school. What type of support is needed in that transition? There are a lot of micro failures that happen in that transition. How do we support students to learn through them? Another one is normalizing wellness. The student wellness and normalizing failure. What are the connections between wellness and normalizing failure? How do we do this? And this is related to the procrastination perfectionism continuum. And then this yellow circle in the middle, this relates to the power and privilege. It's really easy to take risks when you have a safety net. And the advice to students to take risks, be open, take a course you have no background in, that can feel hollow when it's in the context of an institutional structure that penalizes failure. So how do we support all students in embracing and learning from failure? And I mentioned that example of business with respect to fail fast, fail often, and how failure is celebrated in business. But when you look at banking data from the US, and you look at folks who get business loans, if that first business fails, the people who are able to get subsequent loans are usually from the dominant group. They're not from underrepresented groups. And so this celebration of failure is not always applied equally to society. Okay, so some of the things that the group is doing is that we're looking at cognitive psychology research and science of learning research, and how does this intersect with course design? And we've created this pedagogical failure dictionary. There's so much jargon involved here, and we're looking at what can we take from the literature and what does that look like in the context of course design. We're happy to share this if people are interested. We have syllabus templates that are annotated that show how learning through struggle or learning through failure could look like on your syllabus. And another thing we do is we've redesigned courses to highlight process rather than product. And one thing we track during the course is, how are students feeling about failure? What's their definition? How does their definition change over time? If you ask students to give you an example of failure, how does that example change over time? What word is associated? So if everyone could jump over to the chat, and we'll all enter this at the same time. If I say the word failure, what is the first word that comes to your mind? So type it into the chat, but we'll all hit enter at the same time. So if you hear the word failure, what's the next word that comes into your mind? And hit enter. So I see loss, sad, defeat, data, not good enough, shame, stupid, disappointment, experiment, dead end, frustration. Absolutely. And when we survey students about the word they think of with failure versus faculty who are scientists, the faculty are more likely to have slightly more positive words. And so when we survey students right when they come into university, these are some of their most common words: disappointment, struggle, hopeless, embarrassed, I suck, you suck, try again, some variation of those. And then we do these intensive experiences throughout the courses, and then we'll survey students at the end of the course. And there is usually the same words pop up, but there's some new ones. And so what we see towards the end of the course is we see this emphasis on learning and process, which is what we're trying to highlight. Disappointment is still usually the second or third one. It depends on the discipline of the student. But we see this word opportunity pop up that we didn't see at the start. This feeling of embarrassment and words associated with stigma are very much present. This idea of having second chances or trying again. It's okay. And then also importance and preparation. Those are words that didn't appear in any of the pre-list. Deborah asks, what do you think of when you hear the word failure? I think it depends on context. And that's something we do with students as well. Like, is it from my position as a parent? Is it from my position as a professor, or my position as like still learning and always a student? Setting a midterm where I've gotten the time wrong and students don't have time to do it, that would be an example that I think of. In terms of word, I would probably think of like process, but also discomfort. Those two words would probably come to the fore. And so this is some recent data that a student just sent me, and she's still in the process of analyzing, but they've taken student definitions of failure and coded those definitions according to Crestwell. So this is a qualitative coding analysis of these definitions. And these are students just coming from high school, science students, and these are the codes that come up from their definitions. But after they go through the course, if the course is a typical first-year course, these codes stay the same. If they go through a productive struggle themed course that's highlighting process, this is how the codes will shift. And you can just look at the top there, the process and growth. There's still a huge number of students that are highlighting this failure to meet expectations and goals, but there's more that are highlighting this idea of process and growth. So what does this look like in class? There's so many different ways we could thread this into class, and it's really important it's not just one way. It has to be threaded and modeled in lots of different ways. So one way is through think, pair, share questions, where you ask a question, and at the same time you ask students, how confident are you in your answer? So this is a question, when you ask it to first-year students, they're quite confident in their answer. So let's do this together. Let's enter it in the chat. We'll enter our answers all at the same time. So type in the chat, don't press enter. If someone loses weight, where does that mass go? Where does the majority of the mass go? Does it go to energy, sweat, into muscle, breath, something else? I invite you to come into the chat. And if you don't know, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Take a guess. So press enter, go ahead. And so the number one answer of first-year students is energy or sweat. And then I show the results to the class that it's energy or sweat. And over 80% of the classes answer that, and they're very confident in their answer that it's right. And then the class is told that's not the right answer. And they have to confront the fact that they were very confident in an answer that was then wrong. And this is one way we get into the process of learning where our knowledge ends and learning about some of our misconceptions. So then they break into groups and they enter again. And the most common answer is E, something else. And then we tell them again, that's not the right answer. 70 to 85% actually goes into this thing. And the right answer is breath. And you have to follow carbon. It's carbon in breath, carbon dioxide when we breathe out. Students know this, the cycle of metabolism. They can write out all the equations that they learned from high school, but they have trouble translating that information here. So the right answer is breath. And yes, it's not all the mass. There's urea and there's other things, but the majority is breath. But this is a very easy way to model how it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be uncomfortable, but it's really important to include that second question of how confident are you in this answer? So let's do it another way. Where does the mass of this tree come from? So I invite you to enter your answer into the chat, and we'll hit enter all at the same time. Where does the mass of this tree come from? Water, air, soil, minerals from the ground, something else. You go from an acorn up to an oak tree. Go ahead and enter your answer. Where does the mass come from? Most common answer from students is water in first year. Over 90% will say water. Will say that's not the right answer, break into groups. Then they'll say minerals from the ground. They'll say something else. And air is the last thing they choose, even though they can write out the equation for photosynthesis. And the answer is air. It's carbon in carbon dioxide. And so again, actually I should back up to this one. If we just back up for a sec, this one. One thing I say that I forgot to mention is we have to normalize being wrong. This question was asked in the UK to physicians, nutritionists, dietitians, kinesiologists, and only 3% of them got it right. We have to normalize this idea of not knowing, normalize the idea of being wrong. And it's something that our first year students struggle. I just forgot to mention that. So that's one way to model it, with these questions that are troublesome knowledge. And sometimes they align with threshold concepts, these ideas that we really have to understand before we can move forward. So these are called troublesome knowledge, think, pair, share questions. Another important aspect we use is through drawing and sketching. And it's something that students don't always have a lot of time to do, but it can reveal misconceptions. It can reveal where knowledge breaks down. So we ask the students to draw, what would a chromosome look like in a non-dividing cell? We'll give them different prompts. Can you enter in the chat, what do you think students would draw? Not what do you think is right? What do you think students would draw? Can you just enter that in the chat and go ahead and hit enter anytime? Yeah, X's, squiggles, absolutely. Usually they will either draw something condensed like this, they'll draw X's, or they'll draw a smear, squiggles, okay? But when we ask students multiple choice questions about this, we don't always get to the same misconceptions. Students have a misconception that chromosomes always look like X's because that's how we take photos in metaphase. But chromosomes don't exist as X's in our cells. And when they have that misconception, it can lead to problems in understanding meiosis and crossing over and cell division. And so we'll ask students to sketch these out at various stages. So we ask them the previous prompt, and then we'll go, okay, so draw 2 chromosomes right before they're replicated and right after they're replicated. And sometimes students will realize, oh, now my knowledge is breaking down, and they'll realize it during this prompt. But this is some of the drawings that we might get. And through sketches, students highlight that they're more uncomfortable answering questions that involve sketches. But our research shows that they actually have better recall and they remember these misconceptions better when they're revealed through sketches rather than just revealed through getting questions wrong. And so we talk about how we know what we know. And photographs and images and sketches, they prime us to understand things in a certain way. And so we have to go back to, why do we think chromosomes are X's? It's because that's how we take photos at metaphase when they're condensed. That's how we take our scanning electron micrograph images. So I want to talk another thing we do about failures, and I'm just going to lead you through an exercise that we do with students. So if everyone could come over to the chat, and I want you to give me an example of a past failure of yours. And if you don't want to write it publicly in the chat, you can send it just to me by clicking the blue button and selecting my name, and I will read it out anonymously. So can you think of a past failure? We'll take 5 seconds. I will add one as well. Okay, hit enter and we'll share. An experiment that was eaten by a fish. We're going to talk about some fieldwork fails in a little bit. Leaving a Masters of Science program, not getting selected for something all my friends and peers got selected for, failing a sailing exam, entire undergrad GPA, bombed a piano recital, not being able to publish some research, and I made one of my midterms much too long. Any experiment the first time we try it. And I have some private messages here about changing programs, disappointing parents, not listening to myself, listening to others instead. So how would you classify that failure? And what I'm going to introduce you to is this idea of a failure continuum that we've been adapting for science, and it actually comes initially from business. And I'm not going to describe all the terms on this image, but I'll describe a couple. Was the failure because of poor behavior? Or was the failure because of inattention? Inexperience? Was there something wrong with the process? A step was missed in the process? Was it just a really challenging task? Was the process really complex? Was there some uncertainty? Was it hypothesis testing? Was it exploratory testing? So now in the chat, indicate what's your category of your failure. How would you categorize your failure? Go ahead and hit enter and share. How would you categorize that? So we have some inexperience, process complexity, inattention, poor behavior, inexperience, uncertainty. Absolutely. And when we do this with class, we'll do this with our classroom response systems, and students will highlight. And most of the students' examples that they're first giving us are usually on this side. They're usually on the left side of this continuum. And it leads to discussions of, well, aren't some failures bad? Do we actually learn from all our failures? And so they will have a cluster to the left. And we ask students to reflect and, well, think of other failures. Can we shift it so that we're shifting along the continuum to the right? Yes, some failures we don't learn from, some are bad luck, and it's ingenuous to say that all failure is good failure. Some failures we can't recover from. But are there approaches we can take that makes it more likely we'll learn from a failure? Are there ways we can turn more failures into good failures? And this is where we really talk about scientific process and approach to science and good lab book note-taking. And we talk about creativity and how it intersects with science. We cannot talk about any of this work if we don't talk about stigma. And this is some work by Crystal Nunes, who was the postdoc on this study. And she's looking at science student perspectives on how we decrease the stigma of failure. And when you ask students, like, where does most of your stigma come from? What leads to your stigma? When you're asked each of these questions on a Likert scale, they'll almost agree that everything in one way or another will lead to stigma. And so how do we decrease that in the institutional context? What can we do as instructors? What can the university do in terms of university structures? And I just want to read a few quotes here that came out of this. This came out of some of the qualitative coding. I think my fear of failure mostly comes from my parents and how they want me to succeed in school. If I receive a failing grade, I'm more concerned about how they would feel about it rather than how I actually feel. I believe that my fear of failure comes from the fact that I am a first-generation immigrant and my parents could not afford to go to school, so they did not, and I feel like I do not belong in academia. Also, I do not want to retake a course as it's expensive and I cannot afford to. And another example, I feel like my fear of failure comes from inexperience. In my life, I haven't experienced any big failures, so I lack exposure. Failing to me would be a new experience that I'm not comfortable with. It's easy to preach about the importance of failure and list a few ways it has helped, but it doesn't change the fact that every little thing you do in school is graded and people are passed or failed, which can ruin someone's chances at getting into a good program or school. This is what I think about when I think about failing something, which greatly contributes to my fear. And you'll notice that almost all of these are about academic failure. And when we talk about learning from failure, academic failure is only a small piece of this failure pie, if you will. So this is another thing we're looking at with respect to stigma and the importance of structural change. Another aspect is fostering a community of failure. And part of that is normalizing failure in everyday life, in processes of science, and doing it in a meaningful way. One thing could be narratives of failure that professors share, creating safe havens for failure and examples of failure, and the value of humor. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize for their work on CRISPR, and Dr. Doudna has talked quite openly about the value of failure and the value of community, because things are going to fail and things are not going to work. And you need a community that supports you through that. Megan Ward was one of our research assistants who was working on case studies of failure. What are some case studies that we could use as narratives in our courses? And she did this study looking at the fieldwork fail hashtag that was really popular about 4 years ago. And I'm just going to show a few examples here. What she did is she went through this hashtag and she looked at the types of fieldwork fails that people were sharing. Some were just bad luck that you couldn't have prevented. Some you learned from, some you didn't learn from, and some were these like golden nuggets of learning. And these are just a few examples. By David Hamilton, this Friday frilly was also a bit of a fieldwork fail. When frill-necked lizards are released, they immediately run up the nearest tallest object for safety. It's usually a tree. In this case, it was me. Annabelle Dorstein shared, wanted for robbery, robber crab, prime suspect of skillful dislodging and subsequently stealing of a thermal camera, thought to have it brought back to its lair of prized possessions. Do not get fooled by its pretty colors. RIP thermal camera. Many of these fieldwork fails were about lost cameras in the field or about camera placement. Lou Tassetto posted, just admiring my excellent camera placement. Fieldwork fail. And then some of these were turned into this art project. Agatha Stanowick said, accidentally glued myself to a crocodile while attaching a radio transmitter. Obviously, some fails are slightly more dangerous than others. When you spill pheromone solution on yourself and become the sexiest damn tanner beetle in all of Skane. And I also wanted to include this quote from Bobak Ferdowsi, who's an engineer with NASA. And he said, the way Astro Shell phrases it is that locally in the moment, failure is not an option, a la Apollo 13. But we all acknowledge failure is a huge part of what we do, especially if you're like me, and that is literally your job. So if our students are going to go to professions that involve troubleshooting, making mistakes, figuring out why those mistakes happen, we have to make learning about this and talking about this foundational, starting with elementary school, high school, but then especially first year biology. So I mentioned we are looking at power and privilege of failure. We need to look at structural support for failure and EDI implications. And what does that look like in academic policy? Does this mean that we should have more flexible course retake policies, that students should be able to replace grades of earlier courses, be able to credit, no credit certain courses? If they're so afraid of having a blight on their academic record, it's less likely that students will try something new. And students have said that repeatedly. We also have to be really careful of some grit and resilience training programs. We use the phrase resilience-based learning, but we quantify that. We're really careful with how we use that in our work. So grit was really popular with Angela Duckworth's book that came out several years ago. But after it came out, there became this narrative of blame. Like, oh, you would have done better if you had more grit. You would have done better if you were more resilient. And sometimes it can have a layer of blame, but also when there is grit training, resiliency training, it's really focused on the individual. And we have to focus on the structural and the institutional for some of these projects to move forward meaningfully. And so one thing we use more often is this idea of self-regulated learning. Self-regulated learning has failure at its core, and it's a really important part of resilience-based learning. So we just have to be careful of those two words. So another thing that we're doing is that we're looking at what happens to groups when things fail. What types of questions do different groups ask when things fail? Or designing experiments. And it's really pointing to the value of diverse groups. We know that the more diverse a group is, the more interesting and creative questions that they ask. And we will use examples from science and innovation and development to highlight the importance of having diverse groups. And so I thought I would just guide you through one right now. So if you could all be in chat so that you can answer a question for me. So Google owns YouTube, and they are absolutely famous for their development phase testing and their beta testing. And they developed an app that was a direct upload to YouTube app. So you would film it with your phone, you would press one button, and it would directly upload to YouTube. It went through development phase testing, beta testing, and there were no problems at all. But then it launched internationally, and it failed 5 to 10% of the time. 5 to 10% of the time, the image was upside down, and this is considered a failure of the app function. Can you just type in the chat, what do you think was happening? Why was this failing? Any ideas? Just the first thing that comes to mind. Orientation of the phone. Yeah, I was asking this question to some high school students, and a whole bunch of them wrote Australia. They were in Australia, and I was like, no, it wasn't dependent on the country that the person was in, or the language they were speaking, or the operating system. You're absolutely right. It was how the phone orientation is held. And if you're left-handed, you hold the phone in a different orientation than if you're right-handed. And then Google had to come up with a statement saying, we're not biased against left-handed people. We had poor representation, poor diversity on our team. So another thing that we're looking at is how do we create teams that anticipate failures? How do we create teams in science that bounce back from failures in interesting ways? And so that's just one example that we're working with. And there's so many from science that we could explore. And then we do this competition with our students where they bring in inspirational quotes. And then the students were realizing all the inspirational quotes they were bringing in were coming from people from the dominant group. They were coming from white men. And students would purposely go out and try to find quotes from folks from underrepresented groups, folks from women in science, et cetera. And this quote came up from a student, and the students really liked this one. And it's not from science, it's from an actor. But the students really resonated with it. And I thought that I would just read it to you. I want you to know that most of your life will happen in the gray spaces between bliss and heartbreak, between having everything lock into place and having it all fall apart. And in science, we tend to focus on the bliss and the heartbreak, the eureka discovery, the breakthrough, or the experiment failed and I got no data. And those are really polar ends of a spectrum. And we want to pull them close together to realize these little failures are happening all the time that we can learn from. And there are these moments of learning, these sort of golden nuggets of learning that are happening all the time. So this is one that this quote really resonated to students who had come through the failure narrative work for the FLIP, Failure Learning in Progress project. And these are some of the people that worked on some of the data that I shared with you today. And Boris, I know you wanted me to end 20 minutes early, so I think we're right on time. So I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any questions.